Welcome to episode 45 of the AMT podcast. I hope you're all having a good week. Today I want to talk about government intervention, and this is somewhat of a follow-up from the last episode where I analysed and discussed the proposed affordability checks that the UK government want to implement on the betting industry. Now, I concluded that the checks will not serve the purpose that they're intended to. It takes a one-size-fits-all approach to a situation that's complicated, and ultimately it harms winners and those behaving responsibly more so than the losers that it supposedly aims to protect. The saddest part is that gambling and betting are two buzzwords that have such negative connotations with them that the response to this tyrannical proposal by government is going to be rather sober. And if you look back only a few years and realize how easily people rolled over and readily gave up their freedoms to tracking applications and vaccine mandates, it's easy to see why government feel like they can continue to chip away at our freedoms as this proposal will. This proposal will, in my mind, no doubt, prove to be another example of government failure. Government failure is almost the inevitable result when they step in to try and manipulate markets and incentivize behavior. We've seen this so many times over and over again, and their record of failure is so spectacular. One has to wonder why people are so keen to ever support any further laws that impinge on people's freedom. Now, there's several reasons for why governments fail that I want to talk about. Now, this goes back to a bit of economic theory, but the first reason is due to information failure. It's a fraudulent assumption by many that government politicians are experts when it comes to making policy decisions. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Most of the time, they only have limited information on hand. And with that limited information, they miscalculate the true value of the externalities their policies create. Instead of taking the time to properly assess the true value and cost of implementation, they bulldoze their way through and implement the law to the detriment of society. We saw this clearly with COVID. The constant shape-shifting laws in light of new information led to catastrophic implementation. Social distancing, limited family gatherings, enforcing masks and vaccines, all sorts of inconsistent, contradictory government information, which costed hundreds of millions of pounds to implement and enforce, which were completely ineffective. Not only did it fail to contain the virus, but in light of new information and new science, what was true and what was considered fake news or misinformation yesterday turned out to be true later on in some instances, and it led to more division and distrust, not only amongst government and science, but amongst people. With this gambling white paper, only a quick glance is necessary to be able to spot the most obvious inconsistencies and errors that will do little to target problem gambling and hurt profitable or at least responsible gamblers, namely the deposit limits and failure to acknowledge a bettor's long-term winnings outside the losing 90-day window, which I explained in the last episode. It's a clumsy attempt to reduce problem gambling based on limited information that's ultimately going to do more harm than good. The second reason for government failure is due to the waste of taxpayers' money in implementing policies, creating new departments, the admin, the oversight. These new departments have budget demands, and people and politicians act out of self-interest. So they obviously are going to demand the most money possible. Economist Thomas Sowell perfectly sums up government failure, and he retold this story as a summer intern as a 20-year-old for the government Department of Labor, where he was tasked with minimum wage setting in Puerto Rico. Economic theory dictates that as you raise the minimum wage, employment goes down. But there was a second theory put forward by the trade unions, who said that recent hurricanes at the time of collecting data had destroyed the sugarcane, so there was less to collect. So Thomas rightfully suggested to the group that it would be sensible to collect data on the amount of sugarcane standing in the field before and after the hurricane to prove this theory. Whilst he was expecting a congratulations from his peers, he was met with a look of shock in the room, as if to say, look at this idiot, he's actually doing real work. This could ruin us all. Whilst Thomas made the mistake of being actually concerned as to whether or not the law could be beneficial to low-income people, the rest of the department was concerned because the law was providing a third of the income budget to the US Department of Labor. When you begin to realize that government agencies have their own self-interest aside from what they're tasked with doing, you begin to understand why government failed to solve anything. They're not trying to establish justice on earth. They're just trying to keep their well-paying jobs. America has not had a single day of peace since its inception. The military-industrial complex receives $766 billion of the government budget every year. Not because the rest of the world is such a violent and primitive place, but because war is profitable. They need to test their weapons. They need to instigate wars so that they can sell their weapons. They need to prop up dictators so that they can bring them down, so that they can invade their resources. Every government department has a self-interest, and a new gambling regulatory department has the same motivation. If the concern was to really protect the function of society, there are far bigger fish to fry. Gambling, as I already pointed out, is an easy target. It has a negative connotation, and by needlessly impinging on people's freedom, even those who are betting responsibly, the department can manipulate and waive statistics in the face of government and demand more money to implement these ineffective policies. Now, the third reason why governments fail is because they fail to recognize the unintended consequences of their actions, namely the black market. Whether you like it or not, there are 4 vices that men indulge in. Gambling, alcohol, sex, and drugs have existed from time as we know it, and every single government attempt to manage people consuming it has ended in failure. When the US government outlawed alcohol during the Prohibition era, it drove the market into the hands of corrupt politicians and organized criminals like Nucky Thompson, Lucky Luciano, Al Capone, and Arnold Rothstein. Not only did banning alcohol hamper a big source of government tax, it greatly increased their spending budget on propping up departments. Prison populations swelled beyond breaking point. Mafia wars increased in violence as they fought for market domination, and consumers were driven to drugs instead. And talking of drugs, the war on drugs has been another example of abject government failure. The US and UK spend billions on preventative drug measures, yet they are the 2 biggest consumers in the world. There's a running statistic that 1 in every 10 banknotes in the UK have been touched by cocaine. In the US, over $7 billion is spent on either arresting or prosecuting, and $51 billion is spent in total on initiatives to combat usage. Yet it hasn't gone down 1 iota. And I believe this comes down to culture, because you cannot manage or outlaw vices like sex, alcohol, drugs, and gambling when they are fundamentally ingrained in a culture. Take the UAE, where alcohol is legal, yet there's virtually zero violent crime, property damage, or alcohol-related illnesses. The reason being that despite alcohol being legal, it is not part of their culture. The culture that underpins society and public life is influenced by Islam. So despite the fact that cities like Dubai is made up of almost 90% migrants, expats who choose to live there understand that they are in an Islamic country. Alcohol is therefore only served in licensed bars, clubs, and hotels, and is strictly forbidden to be served or consumed in public, where family, safety, and respect for the community is adhered to by everybody. The respect for the culture, coupled with the law, means there is little incentive to break it. The West, which is considered liberal or free, is abused by people who disrupt social cohesion. People abuse their freedom by overindulging in unhealthy vices and then go on to further abuse the free healthcare provided by the NHS. Trying to legalize behavior is like trying to put a lid or band-aid on a problem instead of tackling the root cause, which is the culture. It starts at home. It starts with a shared culture. The UK has made itself a home for gambling. It is so deeply ingrained in British culture. So if the government decide to outlaw how people spend their rightfully earned money on what is for the overwhelming majority of people a harmless and popular vice, it will inevitably prop up the illegal black market. People are going to bet whether you like it or not. Organized criminals and unlicensed firms will welcome such a policy because it will drive business towards them. Government departments will demand bigger budgets as gambling crime goes up on paper and money needs to be spent finding and prosecuting illegal punters. How many more times do we need to see it? We've seen it with prohibition. We've seen it with drugs, where cartels are more powerful than ever now. I have no doubt that propping up a new government department to manage gambling will lead to similar issues. Now, the fourth and final reason for government failure is due to regulatory capture. Now, this happens when governments try to regulate monopoly power. This is when the interests of society are overlooked in the favor of CEOs and managers of firms. For example, the regulator for government might have worked in the industry before, therefore knows the CEOs in the industry, and they can scratch each other's back, so to speak. We see this clearly with investment banking and government, where there is a seeming revolving door between the two. Our current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, worked for Goldman Sachs before going into Parliament in 2015. Former Chancellor of Exchequer, Sajid Javid, announced he'll be working for JP Morgan as a senior advisor, and he also worked in investment banking prior to his career in politics. Tony Blair also worked for JP Morgan after office. Gordon Brown is an advisory board member of investment firm PIMCO. George Osborne joined BlackRock. Philip Hammond is currently a partner of energy investment firm Buckthorn Partners. Alistair Darling sits on Morgan Stanley's board of directors. The list goes on, and the US government has the same problem. I won't list them, but you get the picture by now. But there is a clear trend between politicians who are more likely to be hired by financial entities in the future if they please their future employers through deregulatory policies when in office. And there's also a trend of former bankers entering politics to benefit their friends. Do you see where I'm going with this? Can you imagine the CEOs of some of the biggest bookmakers entering politics? I certainly would not rule it out if this white paper goes through. I would not be surprised to see the likes of Denise Coates or Victor Chandler entering the political arena to either deregulate gambling or hand their old firms favors to the detriment of smaller bookmakers. This was the modus operandi during the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008. Investment banks were recklessly purchasing debt from commercial banks, tranching it and masking it with AAA ratings from credit rating agencies that they paid, no conflict of interest there, and selling it to unknowing investors. When the default started and seemingly safe AAA debt instruments started to fail, some of the biggest investment banks in the world who were holding this toxic debt went under. Their friends in government, namely Henry Paulson, the Secretary of Treasury and former, you guessed it, investment banker at Goldman Sachs, and Timothy Geithner, the current head of, you guessed it, investment bank Warburg Pincus, who was in charge of the New York branch of the Federal Reserve at the time, decided to bail their friends out for hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money, and not a single CEO served a day in prison. Another stinking failure of government intervention. They effectively incentivized risk-taking instead of allowing them to go bankrupt, as they would have done if the free market was allowed to operate without interference. As I've said in the previous episode, the only role of government is to act as a referee, make sure everyone is playing fairly and by the rules, not to incentivize behavior. Law can do that to an extent, but ultimately only a shared culture can. With the amount of money available in post office jobs, or at least within department budgets, and with the limited information available on hand, and with the constant revolving door between government and business, and ultimately with self-interest being the fundamental underpinning of decisions, it's little wonder why government are so inefficient at intervening in the markets. Governments could solve war, poverty, starvation, and societal division at the drop of a hat, but problem solving is not profitable. Self-interest motivates everyone, from the job you take, to the house you buy, to the woman you marry. But when self-interest is to the cost of society, as is the case with most political decisions, that's when it becomes problematic. This new proposal by government to limit people from gambling under the guise of protection is a phony excuse to mask the fact that politicians and government departments want more power, more money, and new jobs to solve an imaginary problem which they've created. The 90-day window that the white paper proposes is a carefully designed trap to limit profitable and responsible punters so they can manipulate statistics to show they've reduced or tackled problem gambling. So if you were a communist or Marxist cheering for bigger government, hopefully I've persuaded you a little bit as to why smaller government and market freedom is what truly allows us to live our best lives and unleash human potential. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it was insightful. Let me know in the comments what you think. Share where possible, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.